Good day, dear listeners. Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where passion, betrayal, and vengeance intertwine beneath the glittering chandeliers of England's most powerful estates. Today's tale is one of impossible resurrection, shattered trust, and a Christmas ball that will unravel every carefully kept secret of the aristocracy. But before we step into the snow-dusted world of 1868, I have a question for you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Are you curled up in bed, with the rain tapping against your window? Perhaps you're commuting through a bustling city, or maybe you're thousands of miles away, in a quiet corner of the globe, seeking escape into another time, another life. Wherever you are, London, Lagos, Los Angeles, or beyond, you are not alone in this story. You are about to witness a woman rise from the ashes of her own death, walk into a room full of those who mourned her, and speak a truth so devastating it will bring an entire dukedom to its knees. So settle in. Light a candle if you wish. Pour yourself something warm. Because tonight, we begin with a ghost. And ghosts, as you know, always come back for a reason. The snow fell in silence over Thornfield Abbey, soft and endless, blanketing the sprawling Derbyshire estate in a shroud of white that seemed almost reverent. It was Christmas Eve, and the great house blazed with light, every window aglow, every corridor alive with the murmur of servants preparing for the grandest ball of the season. The Duke of Ashworth spared no expense. He never did. His wealth was ancient, his title unassailable, and his grief, though carefully hidden beneath layers of aristocratic composure, was absolute. It had been 6 months since the plane crash, 6 months since Seraphine Harcourt, his fiancée, had boarded that ill-fated airship bound for Paris, a journey meant to be brief, a matter of settling her late mother's estate. 6 months since the news arrived by telegram, terse and final. Catastrophic failure. No survivors. All presumed dead. The Duke had received the message in his study, standing before the fire, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He had read it twice. Then he had folded the paper, placed it on the mantel, and returned to his correspondence as though nothing had happened. His face had betrayed nothing. His voice, when he spoke to his valet later that evening, had been steady. But those who knew him well, his younger sister, his man of business, the housekeeper who had served his family for 30 years, saw the change. Caelan Greystoke, Duke of Ashworth, had always been cold. But after Seraphine's death, he became something else, something harder, something impenetrable. He did not speak her name. He did not attend the memorial service held in her honor at St. James's. He did not visit the empty grave in the Harcourt family plot. Instead, he threw himself into his estates, his investments, his duties. He accepted every social invitation. He danced at every ball. He smiled, rarely, but enough. And when the whispers began, when the dowagers leaned close over their teacups and wondered aloud whether the Duke's heart had ever truly been engaged, he offered no defense. Let them think what they wished. Let them believe him heartless. It was easier than the truth. Tonight, Thornfield Abbey was a spectacle. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter palace, every surface draped in ivory silk and evergreen boughs, the chandeliers dripping with crystals that caught the candlelight and scattered it across the polished floor like fallen stars. The air smelled of cinnamon and clove, of pine and beeswax, and beneath it all, the faint metallic tang of snow brought in on the hems of cloaks and the soles of boots. The guests arrived in carriages that crunched over the gravel drive, their breath misting in the cold air as liveried footmen handed them down and ushered them inside. Countesses and earls, Viscounts and barons, the cream of English society, all of them eager to be seen at the Duke's Christmas ball, all of them hungry for gossip, for scandal, for anything that might relieve the tedium of another frigid winter in the country. Caelan stood at the top of the grand staircase, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression as unreadable as carved marble. He was dressed in black, as always, a tailcoat cut to perfection, a waistcoat of midnight silk, a cravat tied with military precision. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing the sharp lines of his jaw, the cold gray of his eyes. He was 32, and he looked like a man who had never smiled in his life. Your Grace, the Marquis of Dunmore and Lady Dunmore. The butler's voice rang out, and Caelan inclined his head fractionally as the couple ascended the stairs. Lady Dunmore curtsied, her plump face flushed with pleasure at being acknowledged. Her husband muttered something about the weather. Caelan murmured a polite response and watched them pass into the ballroom. Your Grace, Lord and Lady Pemberton. Another bow, another meaningless exchange. Your Grace, the Earl of Westford. And so it continued, a procession of titles and faces, none of which held his interest for more than a moment. He performed his role flawlessly, as he always did. The perfect host, the unshakable Duke. But inside, beneath the polished exterior, there was nothing. Only the cold. Your Grace. The voice was soft, hesitant. He turned to find his sister, Vivienne, standing beside him. She was barely 20, pale and delicate, with their mother's fair hair and their father's sharp cheekbones. She wore a gown of silver satin that made her look like a winter sprite, and her blue eyes were anxious. You should go down, she said quietly. People are beginning to notice. Let them notice. Caelan. Her hand touched his sleeve, a fleeting gesture. Please, just for tonight. Try to what? His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. Smile? Pretend? Dance with some vapid debutante and pretend I care whether her father approves of me? Vivienne flinched, but she did not look away. Try to live, she said softly. Just a little. For me. He held her gaze for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. Very well. He descended the staircase with Vivienne on his arm, and the ballroom seemed to hold its breath as they entered. Conversations paused, heads turned. The orchestra, which had been playing a light waltz, faltered for half a beat before resuming. The Duke of Ashworth had arrived. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man accustomed to command, nodding here, murmuring a greeting there, always polite, always distant. Vivienne stayed close, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow, and he was grateful for her presence. She was the only person in the world who did not expect him to be anyone other than what he was. Your Grace. Lord Pemberton materialized at his side, his florid face gleaming with perspiration despite the cold. A magnificent evening, truly magnificent. Lady Pemberton was just saying, "Thank you, Pemberton." Caelan's tone was courteous but final. He moved on before the man could continue. Duke Ashworth. This time it was Lady Harrington, a widow of formidable reputation and even more formidable ambition. She smiled up at him, her fan fluttering. How wonderful to see you in such fine spirits. Indeed. He did not smile back. She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. I must say, Your Grace, there has been much talk this season. Many believe it is time you considered remarriage. A man of your position, your wealth, surely you must think of the future. I think of many things, Lady Harrington. His gray eyes were cold as winter steel. Remarriage is not among them. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Of course, Your Grace. Forgive me. He inclined his head and moved on, Vivian's grip tightening slightly on his arm. "You might have been kinder," she murmured. "I might have been many things." They reached the edge of the ballroom, where tall windows overlooked the snow-covered gardens. Kaelin released Vivian's arm and stood alone, staring out at the night. The reflection in the glass showed a man in black, solitary and unapproachable, surrounded by light and laughter, and life but utterly separate from it. He did not hear the doors open behind him. He did not hear the sudden, rippling silence that spread through the ballroom like frost across water. He did not hear the gasps, the whispers, the strangled exclamations of shock. But he felt it. The shift in the air, the weight of 100 gazes turning toward the entrance. And then he heard the butler's voice, trembling, disbelieving. "Miss Seraphine Harcourt." The world stopped. Kaelin turned slowly, his body moving before his mind could catch up. And there, at the top of the grand staircase, framed by the glow of 1,000 candles, stood Seraphine. She was alive. She wore black, which was fitting for a ghost, a gown of midnight silk that clung to her slender frame, the bodice embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like frost. Her dark hair was pinned in an elaborate coil at the nape of her neck, a few loose tendrils framing her face. Her skin was pale, almost luminous, and her eyes, those wide, dark eyes that had haunted his dreams for 6 months, were fixed on him. She did not smile. She did not move. She simply stood there, a specter returned from the dead, and the entire ballroom held its breath. Kaelin felt something crack inside him, something he had thought long since frozen and dead. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart, which had not truly beaten in half a year, began to pound. Seraphine. Her name escaped him before he could stop it, raw and broken, and she flinched as though he had struck her. For a moment, no one moved. The orchestra had fallen silent. The guests stared, frozen in a tableau of shock and scandal. And then, slowly, Seraphine began to descend the staircase. Each step was measured, deliberate. She did not look away from him. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, and in it he saw something that made his blood run cold. She was not here for reconciliation. She was here for revenge. The crowd parted as she reached the bottom of the stairs, drawing back as though she carried a plague. Whispers erupted on all sides, hissing like wind through dead leaves. Impossible! She's dead. How is she here? What does it mean? But Seraphine did not acknowledge them. She walked straight toward Kaelin, her chin held high, her expression calm and cold as winter itself. She stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough that he could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. "Your Grace." Her voice was soft, but it carried in the silence, every word clear as a bell. "Forgive the intrusion. I know this must be unexpected." Unexpected. The word tasted like ash. He could not look away from her, could not breathe. "You're dead." "So I have been told." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "And yet, here I stand." "How?" "That," she said quietly, "is a long story, and not one I intend to tell in front of your guests." He became aware, suddenly, of the eyes on them, the avid, hungry stares of the entire assembly. His jaw tightened. "Then why are you here?" Her smile vanished. "Because I have something you need to hear. Something I should have told you 6 months ago before I left. Before—" She broke off, her voice catching. "Before everything changed. Seraphine. Not here." Her gaze flicked past him to the crowd, then back. "Please, grant me 5 minutes of your time. Alone." Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to turn away, to protect himself from whatever pain she was about to inflict. But he could not. Not when she was standing before him, alive and real, and so achingly familiar that it made his chest tighten. Very well. He turned without another word and strode toward the doors that led to the library, knowing she would follow. Behind them, the ballroom erupted into chaos, but he did not care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them tear his reputation to shreds if they wished. All that mattered was the woman walking silently at his side, the ghost who had come back to haunt him. The library was dark and cold, the fire unlit. Kalen crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands braced on the sill, staring out at the snow. He could hear her breathing, soft and unsteady, could feel her presence like a brand against his skin. "Speak," he said, his voice rough. "Tell me what you came to say." For a long moment she was silent. Then, slowly, carefully, she began. "The plane did crash," she said. "Everything you were told was true. The engine failed over the channel. We went down in minutes." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. "I survived. I don't know how. When I woke, I was in a fishing village on the French coast, half drowned and barely alive. The locals took me in. They thought I was a miracle. Why didn't you write?" The words came out harder than he intended. "Why didn't you send word?" "I tried." Her voice broke, just slightly. "I sent 3 letters. None of them reached you." He turned then, unable to stop himself. She stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. 3 letters, he repeated, in 6 months. I had no money, no identification, no proof of who I was. The French authorities thought I was mad. They kept me in a convent hospital for weeks, trying to... She stopped, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I came back as soon as I could. And I came back because I had to tell you the truth." "What truth?" She met his gaze, and in that moment, he saw it. The thing she had been hiding, the secret that had driven her here, to this place, on this night. "I didn't leave to settle my mother's estate," she said quietly. "I left because I was pregnant." The world tilted. Kalen stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words, to make sense of them. "Pregnant?" "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "With your child. And you didn't tell me." "I didn't know how." Tears spilled down her cheeks now, unchecked. "We weren't married. The scandal would have destroyed both of us. I thought if I could go away, have the baby quietly, give it to a family who could care for it." She broke off, her breath hitching. "I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me." His voice was low, dangerous. "You thought lying to me, leaving me, letting me believe you were dead. You thought that was protection?" "I didn't plan to die." The words burst out of her raw and furious. "I didn't plan for any of this. I was trying to do the right thing, the only thing I could do, and instead I lost everything. The baby, my life, you. The baby." He took a step toward her, his heart pounding. "What happened to the baby?" She closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice was hollow. "I lost it. In the crash, the doctors in France said there was nothing they could do." Silence. He should have felt something. Grief, rage, anything. But there was only numbness, a cold so deep it felt like drowning. "Why are you here, Seraphine?" His voice was flat, empty. "Why come back now? Why tell me this?" She opened her eyes, and the look she gave him was fierce, almost defiant. "Because I wanted you to know. Because you deserve to know what you lost. And because..." She hesitated, then continued, her voice trembling. "Because I couldn't let you go on thinking I abandoned you for no reason. You did abandon me. I know." The tears came faster now, streaking her pale cheeks. I know, and I will live with that guilt for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand. I loved you. I loved you so much that I was willing to destroy my own life to protect yours. He stared at her. This woman he had thought he knew. This ghost who had returned to shatter him all over again. And he realized, with a cold, bitter clarity, that he had been wrong. He had thought her death had broken him. But it was this truth, this impossible, agonizing truth that would destroy him. Get out! She flinched as though he had struck her. Kaelin, get out! His voice was ice, lethal and final. Leave this house. Leave my life. I never want to see you again. Please. Now. She stood there for a moment longer, her face crumpling, her body shaking with silent sobs. Then, slowly, she turned and walked to the door. She paused on the threshold, her hand on the frame, and looked back at him one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. And then she was gone. Kaelin stood alone in the dark library, the snow falling silently outside the window, and felt the last remnants of his heart turn to ash. The ballroom was still in chaos when Seraphine emerged. She could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers that followed her like shadows. Lady Harrington stood near the entrance, her eyes alight with malicious curiosity. Lord Pemberton whispered urgently to his wife, who covered her mouth with her fan. The Countess of Dorset looked positively gleeful, as though Christmas had come early and brought with it the scandal of the century. Seraphine lifted her chin and walked through them all, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the doors ahead. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not now. She found Vivian waiting near the entrance, her face pale and anxious, her hands clasped tightly together. Miss Harcourt, the young woman said softly, stepping forward. Are you all right? Seraphine managed a faint smile, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. No, but I will be. What will you do now? I don't know. She glanced back toward the library, where Kaelin remained, hidden in the darkness. But I cannot stay here. Vivian hesitated, then reached out and took Seraphine's hand, squeezing it gently. If you need anything, a place to stay, someone to talk to, please, let me help you. Seraphine felt something tighten in her throat, a painful knot of gratitude and grief. Thank you, but I think it's best if I go. Where will you go? I have a cousin in Bath. I'll write to her. Perhaps she'll take me in. She tried to sound confident, but the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Her cousin had not spoken to her in years, not since Seraphine's engagement to the Duke had been announced. The Harcourts had never been wealthy, and the sudden elevation in status had caused jealousy and resentment among the extended family. Promise me you'll send word, Vivian said urgently. Promise me you'll let me know you're safe. I promise. Seraphine turned and walked toward the grand doors, her head held high, and as she stepped out into the cold night air, she felt the first stirrings of something she had not felt in 6 months. Not freedom, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. Behind her, inside the blazing ballroom, the Duke of Ashworth stood at the window and watched her disappear into the snow. And for the first time since her supposed death, he allowed himself to feel. The pain was excruciating. The days that followed were strange and fractured. Seraphine took a room at a modest inn in the village, far from the prying eyes of the aristocracy. The innkeeper's wife, a kind woman with graying hair and a soft voice, asked no questions and seemed genuinely pleased to have a quiet, respectable guest. Seraphine paid for a week in advance with the last of the money she had managed to borrow from Vivian before leaving Thornfield Abbey. She spent her time walking through the snow-covered countryside, trying to make sense of the wreckage of her life. The cold air stung her cheeks and made her eyes water, but she welcomed it. Pain was better than numbness. Feeling anything at all was better than the void that had consumed her in those long months in France. She had expected Kalen to hate her. She had prepared herself for his anger, his rejection. But what she had not anticipated was the depth of his pain, the way his face had crumpled when she told him about the child. In that moment, she had seen something she had never seen before in all the time she had known him. Vulnerability. Raw, unguarded, devastating vulnerability. And it had nearly broken her. She had thought telling the truth would set her free. Instead, it had only bound her more tightly to him, to the past, to the future they would never have. At night, alone in her small room, she lay awake and listened to the wind howling outside the window. She thought about the child she had lost, the tiny life that had existed for such a brief, fragile time. She had not wanted it at first. The terror and shame had been overwhelming. But as the weeks had passed, as her body had changed, she had begun to feel something else. Hope. The hope that perhaps this child would be a new beginning. That perhaps she could build a life away from society's judgment, away from the suffocating expectations of the aristocracy. That perhaps she could be happy. And then the crash had happened, and everything had been taken from her. The doctors in France had been kind, but blunt. There was nothing they could do. The injuries had been too severe. The baby was gone. She had not cried at first. She had simply lain in the narrow bed in the convent hospital, staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing. It was only later, when she was alone, that the grief had come. And when it came, it had nearly drowned her. But she had survived. She always survived. That was her curse. In Thornfield Abbey, Kalen retreated into himself. He refused all visitors. He canceled all engagements. He spent his days in the library, staring at the fire, drinking whiskey that tasted like ashes. Vivian tried to reach him, but he turned her away with a coldness that made her eyes fill with tears. His man of business tried to discuss urgent matters, tenants, investments, legal documents that required his signature. But he waved him off with barely a word. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, who had known him since he was a boy, could not coax him out of his silence. He had thought Seraphine's death had been the end. But now he understood that it had only been the beginning. The worst part, the unbearable, agonizing part, was that he still loved her. He hated himself for it. He hated her for making him feel it. But the love remained, stubborn and relentless, like a wound that refused to heal. He thought about the child constantly. A child he had never known existed until it was already gone. A child who might have had Seraphine's eyes, his mother's smile, some perfect combination of them both. A child who would have been the heir to Thornfield, the future of the Greystoke line. Gone. All of it. Gone. And the woman he had loved, still loved, God help him, had kept it from him, had lied to him, had chosen to face it alone rather than trust him. That was what cut deepest. Not the loss itself, though that was unbearable, but the knowledge that she had not believed he would stand by her, that she had thought him so weak, so concerned with propriety and reputation, that he would have abandoned her in her darkest hour. Did she truly know him so little, or had he given her reason to doubt? He thought back to their courtship, trying to remember what he had said, what he had done, how he had behaved. He had been careful, always careful. He had followed every rule of society, every expectation. He had courted her properly, with chaperones and calling cards and formal proposals. He had been the perfect gentleman. And in being perfect, he had perhaps failed to be real. He had never told her about his own fears, about the weight of the title, The crushing responsibility of being a duke at such a young age, about the loneliness that came with it, the isolation. He had never told her about his father's death, the way it had hollowed him out, the way he had vowed never to feel that kind of pain again. He had kept himself locked away, safe behind walls of ice and propriety, and she had done the same. Two people, desperately in love, both too afraid to be vulnerable. Was it any wonder it had ended in disaster? It was Vivian who finally intervened. A week after the Christmas ball, she arrived at Seraphine's inn without warning, her cloak dusted with snow, her expression determined. The innkeeper's wife led her upstairs, and Vivian knocked softly on the door of Seraphine's room. "Miss Harcourt," she called. "It's Vivian. May I come in?" There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened, and Seraphine stood there, looking pale and tired, but composed. She wore a simple day dress of dark blue, her hair pinned back in a loose knot. Without the elaborate gowns and jewels she had worn as the Duke's fiancée, she looked younger, more fragile. "Lady Vivian," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" "Trying to save my brother from himself." Vivian stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pulling off her gloves and sitting down in the room's single chair. She gestured for Seraphine to sit on the bed. "He's destroying himself, Miss Harcourt. He won't eat. He won't sleep. He won't speak to anyone. And I think—" She paused, her blue eyes searching Seraphine's face. "I think you're the only one who can reach him." "I doubt that very much." Seraphine's voice was bitter. "He told me to leave. He never wants to see me again." He was hurt, angry, overwhelmed. Vivian leaned forward, her expression earnest. "But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. In fact, I think it means the opposite." Seraphine shook her head slowly. "It doesn't matter. I lost the right to his love when I lied to him. Then earn it back." The words hung in the air, stark and challenging. Seraphine stared at her, feeling something stir in her chest, a flicker of hope, or perhaps just the memory of what hope had once felt like. How? By fighting for him. Vivian reached out and took her hand. By refusing to let him push you away. By showing him that love, real love, doesn't give up, even when things are impossible. I don't know if I can. You came back from the dead, Miss Harcourt. A faint smile touched Vivian's lips. "I think you can do anything." Seraphine felt tears prick her eyes. "He hates me." "No." Vivian's voice was soft, but certain. "He hates himself, for not being the man you needed, for not making you feel safe enough to tell him the truth. He's drowning in guilt and grief, and he doesn't know how to survive it." She squeezed Seraphine's hand. "But you do. You've survived worse. And if you still love him, if there's any part of you that wants to try, then you have to go back. What if he turns me away again? Then you try again, and again, until he understands that you're not going anywhere." Seraphine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. It would be so much easier to walk away, to start over somewhere new, somewhere no one knew her name or her history, to build a quiet life, free from scandal and heartbreak. But she had tried that once, in France, and it had been a kind of death. She opened her eyes and met Vivian's gaze. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll try." That night, Seraphine stood outside Thornfield Abbey, staring up at the darkened windows. Snow drifted down around her, catching in her hair, melting on her skin. She was freezing, terrified, and utterly determined. She had come back from death once. She could do it again. She walked to the front door and knocked, her gloved hand making a soft, hollow sound against the wood. A footman answered, his eyes widening in shock when he saw her. "Miss Harcourt." "I need to see the Duke." His Grace is not receiving visitors. Tell him I'm not leaving until he sees me." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Tell him. I will stand here all night if I have to." The footman hesitated, clearly torn between his duties and his sympathy for the shivering woman on the doorstep. Finally, he nodded. "Wait here, miss. I'll see what I can do." He disappeared inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Seraphine waited, her heart pounding, her breath misting in the cold air. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The cold seeped through her cloak, through her gown, into her very bones. Her feet began to go numb. Her fingers ached. But she did not move. She had made a promise. To Vivian, to herself. And she would keep it. Finally, she heard footsteps on the marble floor. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The door swung open wider, and there he was. Kalen looked terrible. His hair was disheveled, his cravat missing, his shirt open at the throat. There were shadows beneath his eyes, deep and dark, and his face was haggard, hollowed out by grief and sleepless nights. He had lost weight, she realized. His cheekbones stood out sharply, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. But when he saw her, something flickered in his gaze, something raw and desperate and alive. Seraphine. Her name came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "Not this time. Not unless you tell me, to my face, that you don't love me anymore, that you want me gone. And even then," her voice wavered, "even then, I'm not sure I can walk away." He stared at her, his jaw working as though he were trying to find words and failing. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking." She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "I'm asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me back into your life. I'm asking you to take a chance on a future that might be just as messy and complicated and painful as the past. But that might also be—" She broke off, tears streaming down her face. "That might also be worth it." For a long moment he said nothing. He simply stood there, looking at her with an expression she could not read. And then, slowly, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch unbearably gentle. "I hate you," he whispered. "I hate you for leaving. I hate you for lying. I hate you for making me feel things I swore I would never feel again. I know," her voice was barely audible. "And I love you." His voice cracked, and she saw the tears in his eyes, saw the way his hands trembled against her skin. "God help me. I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life. More than this estate. More than my title. More than my own cursed pride." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and felt something inside her shatter and rebuild all at once. "Then let me stay," she whispered. "Let me prove that I deserve it." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and buried his face in her hair. She felt him trembling, felt the ragged rhythm of his breathing, felt the dampness of his tears against her temple. And she held him just as tightly, pouring everything she had into that embrace, all her love, all her regret, all her desperate hope for the future. They stood there in the snow, two people who had lost everything and found each other again. And for the first time in 6 months, the cold did not feel quite so unbearable. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice rough. "Please, before you freeze to death." She laughed, a broken, watery sound, and let him lead her into the warmth of the abbey. The weeks that followed were not easy. Seraphine moved back into Thornfield Abbey, not as Kalen's fiancée, but as something more tentative, more fragile. A guest, perhaps, or a friend, or something that had no name yet, but might in time become something real. They spent hours talking, unraveling the tangled threads of their past, laying bare every wound and scar. She told him about the crash in vivid detail, the screaming of the engines, the sickening lurch as the airship began to fall, the impact that had stolen consciousness and nearly stolen her life. She told him about waking up in the fishing village, confused and in pain, surrounded by people speaking a language she barely understood. She told him about the convent hospital, the nuns who had cared for her, the doctors who had tried to save the baby and failed. He told her about the emptiness that had consumed him after her death, about the way he had thrown himself into work, into duty, into anything that might distract him from the gaping hole in his chest. He told her about the nightmares, the ones where he saw her drowning, where he reached for her and found only water. He told her about the guilt, the irrational, crushing guilt that perhaps, if he had been a better man, a more open man, she might have trusted him enough to stay. They fought sometimes. Old wounds reopened easily, and there were moments when the pain was too much, when they said things they didn't mean or meant too much. But they always came back to each other, always found their way through the anger to the truth beneath, and slowly, painfully, they began to heal. The scandal, of course, was immense. The entire aristocracy buzzed with gossip about the dead woman who had returned, the duke who had taken her back, the child who had never been born. Some condemned them. The Countess of Dorset declared them both morally bankrupt and refused to receive Seraphine at any future gatherings. Lord Pemberton muttered darkly about the decline of proper society. Lady Harrington suggested, with venomous sweetness, that perhaps the Duke had been bewitched. Others pitied them. The Duchess of Marlborough, a widow herself, sent a kind note expressing her sympathies. The Marquess of Dunmore, who had lost his own son to illness years before, offered Caelan his condolences and his support. A few, a very few, admired their courage. Vivian's friend, Lady Caroline Fairfax, declared it the most romantic thing she had ever heard, and began spreading a rather embellished version of the story through her own social circles. Caelan did not care. He had spent too much of his life worrying about what others thought, about maintaining the perfect image, the unblemished reputation. Now, the only opinion that mattered was Seraphine's. One evening, as they sat together in the library, the same library where she had first told him the truth, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, Seraphine turned to him and said, "Do you ever think about what might have been, if the crash had never happened, if I had told you about the baby from the start?" He considered the question, his gray eyes thoughtful as he gazed into the flames. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I think—" He paused, reaching for her hand, and lacing his fingers through hers. "I think we would have been different people. Happier, perhaps, but not stronger. Do you regret it? Any of it?" "I regret the pain." His voice was quiet but firm. "I regret the lies. I regret every moment I spent thinking you were dead. Every night I spent alone in this house, believing I would never see you again." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "But I do not regret this. Us. Now. We have been tested in ways most people never are, and we survived. We found our way back to each other. That means something." She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "What does it mean?" "It means that what we have is real. Not perfect. Not easy. But real." He pulled her closer until she was nestled against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. "And that is worth more than all the perfection in the world." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire, feeling the warmth seep into their bones. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. But inside, they were safe, together. Spring came slowly to Derbyshire, as it always did. The snow melted gradually, revealing the brown earth beneath, and then, bit by bit, green shoots began to appear. Crocuses pushed through the soil in the gardens. The trees budded, birds returned, filling the air with song. And with the spring came change. Caelan and Seraphine were married in a small ceremony in the Abbey's chapel, attended only by Vivienne and a handful of close friends. There were no grand announcements, no elaborate celebrations, just two people, standing before God and each other, promising to love and protect and forgive. The vicar, an elderly man who had known Caelan since boyhood, spoke simply and eloquently about the nature of love. Not the easy, pretty love of storybooks, but the hard, enduring love that survived storms and emerged stronger. The kind of love that required courage and sacrifice and, above all, faith. When Caelan slipped the ring onto Seraphine's finger, his hand was steady. And when she looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with tears and joy and hope, he felt something he had thought lost forever. Peace. After the ceremony, they walked together through the gardens, Vivienne trailing behind them at a discreet distance. The air smelled of earth and new growth, and the sun was warm on their faces. "Are you happy?" Seraphine asked, her arm linked through his. He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Yes," he said simply. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I am truly happy. Even with all the scandal, all the whispers, especially with all that." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "Because it means we chose each other, despite everything, despite society, despite propriety, despite all the reasons we should have walked away. We chose love, and that is the bravest thing I have ever done." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "I love you, Caelan Greystoke." "And I love you, Seraphine Greystoke." He pulled her close and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Behind them, Vivienne smiled and turned away, giving them their privacy. They did not have a perfect life. The scars of the past did not simply vanish with a wedding ceremony. There were still moments of doubt, of fear, of old wounds reopening. There were nights when Seraphine woke from nightmares of falling, of drowning, of losing everything again. There were days when Caelan retreated into himself, overwhelmed by emotion he did not know how to express. But they had each other, and they had learned, through pain and loss, how to be honest, how to be vulnerable, how to fight for their love instead of against it. One year after the Christmas ball, Seraphine stood at the window of the Abbey's master bedroom, watching the snow fall once more. She rested her hand on her swollen belly, feeling the flutter of life within, and smiled. This time was different. This time, she was not alone. This time, she had told Caelan the moment she suspected, and he had been there for every step, every doctor's visit, every moment of fear and joy and anticipation. Caelan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. His hands covered hers on her belly, and they stood together, feeling their child move beneath their joined hands. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. "That I'm grateful." She leaned back against him, closing her eyes. "For all of it, even the pain, because it brought me here, to you, to us, to this, to us." He turned her gently in his arms, his gray eyes soft and warm in a way they had never been before. "I love you, Seraphine. I love you too." And as the snow fell softly outside, they stood together in the light, two souls who had been broken and remade, who had died and come back to life, who had found in each other the only truth that mattered. Love was not perfect. It was not easy. It was not without cost. But it was real, and it was worth fighting for. Always, the child was born in the spring, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet strength. They named her Hope because that was what she represented. The hope that had carried them through the darkest times. The hope that had brought them back to each other. The hope that would carry them into the future. And in the years that followed, as they raised their daughter in the halls of Thornfield Abbey, Kaelin and Seraphine never forgot the lesson they had learned that cold Christmas Eve. That some truths are worth dying for, and some loves are worth coming back to life for. That revenge, in the end, is not always about destruction. Sometimes it is about reclaiming what was taken, about rising from the ashes, about refusing to let the world define you. Seraphine had walked into that ballroom as a ghost, ready to haunt the man who had not fought for her. But she had left as a woman reborn, ready to fight for the love she had thought lost forever. And Kaelin, the cold and unreadable Duke, had finally learned that some walls are meant to be broken, that vulnerability is not weakness, that love requires not perfection, but courage. They built a life together, not the perfect, scandal-free life society expected, but a real one. A life filled with laughter and tears, with triumphs and failures, with children who grew up knowing that love was something worth fighting for. And when Seraphine was old, sitting in the gardens of Thornfield Abbey with her grandchildren playing at her feet, she would tell them the story of the Christmas ball, of the woman who returned from the dead, of the Duke who learned to love. And they would listen, wide-eyed and wondering, and ask her if it was true. And she would smile and say, every word. Because some stories, no matter how impossible they seem, are real, and the best ones always are. The end.